my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, John Cohen, who is a widely published magazine writer and author of nonfiction books on scientific topics. He is a senior correspondent with Science and has published widely and possibly also wildly. He can bring that up if he wants to. New Yorker, he's published in the New Yorker, Atlantic, Monthly, the New York Times Magazine, Smithsonian, Technology Review, Slate. His television appearances include PBS NewsHour, The Today Show, The Larry King Show. He's been on several and BBC radio shows. As I said, he's worked on a wide variety of topics: genetics, primate research, evolution, bioterrorism, research funding, reproductive biology, but he specializes in biomedicine and is most widely known for coverage of epidemics, HIV/AIDS, COVID-19, Ebola, influenza, immunology, vaccines, and global health. He's coordinated and appeared in 2 multi-part series on the PBS NewsHour that focused on efforts to end the AIDS epidemic, which won a national Emmy. I highly recommend those. Those are available online. You can see those. And today he will be presenting reporting on economics. So please join me in welcoming John Cohen. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Esther. It's a very, very kind introduction. It's a long list of things and I'm embarrassed. I'm going to share my screen and it's going to, I think, create a gap for a moment. So let me try and do that. Can somebody allow me to share the screen? Whoop.
Yep, that's about to happen right now.
Okay.
All right, and here you go.
Okay. I am now, okay, great. All right. Give me just a moment to, everything in Zoom time takes a little bit longer than we want. Let's see if I can blow this up. My beach ball's spinning. Thank you for having me today. And can you see my screen now? Is that clear?
Yes.
So I have a concept that many people don't really understand what science reporting is. And my definition, I think, is much broader than the way many people think of it. And so I want to run through how I view what I do and sort of the scope and scale of it. And I also, for high school teachers, Science Magazine is a free resource for much of our content. And we have a terrific staff of people I work with who are all around the world. And it's geared for anyone. It's not just written for scientists. And it's certainly at a level that high school students should be able to understand it. Part of what I love to do that COVID-19 has taken away from me is the ability to go out there and meet with people. And this first story I did is about the genome editor CRISPR, which confused me. So I asked a local laboratory whether I could come in and do a CRISPR experiment. And as the headline said, I failed miserably. So what do I focus on? I focus on global health. And that is a broad topic in and of itself. It's basically disease anywhere in the world. And I look at a great variety of diseases. I love vaccines. They're my favorite topic, and they have been since I was 13 years old and read a book that changed my life, a book called Breakthrough by Richard Carter about the development of the first polio vaccine in Jonas Salk. And Jonas Salk became part of my life. I made up my own major at the University of California, San Diego in science writing, and Salk's Institute was next door, and I convinced him to allow me to write about him. That is why I became interested in HIV/AIDS research several years later when he started working on an AIDS vaccine. That led me to write a book that I spent 12 years on, Shots in the Dark, about the search for an AIDS vaccine. So that's been a centerpiece of my career. I've written a lot about reproductive biology, and my wife had 4 miscarriages, and we had some very surprising things happen, including 2 kids without any interventions. at 42 and 44. And so because of all the bad information we received, I wrote a book about the science of miscarriage. But I remain very interested in reproductive biology. I write about politics. Politics and science are inseparable. And I think we see that in COVID-19 everywhere. I write about surfing. I surf, and there's a lot of science that overlaps with surfing. I'm very proud of a story I did about the first really good artificial surfing wave. And I went and visited the wave in California and wrote about that. And I wrote about wetsuit research. I wrote about a fin that has a tracking device in it to gather data for climate research. I profile people. Profiles are probably the most digestible form of journalism. I think of journalism as basically breaking into three categories, and it's individuals, it's institutions, and it's ideas. And you can use any one of those three categories to frame a story. And profiles about individuals is kind of the easiest way to grab people. I write a lot about the science of art and culture. We did a special issue on the 200th anniversary of Frankenstein. And I wrote about all the scientific literature about Frankenstein. And there's an artist here in San Diego who happens to be a scientist who studies viruses and bacteria and then does these incredibly beautiful watercolors. I did a story about the naming of genes that use Halloween sort of names. Much of what I do is fundamental basic research. Hepatitis B is a very complicated virus, and this is a story. And again, I framed it around a doctor who has hepatitis B because the topic is so complicated that it often helps to have an individual to get into that difficult terrain. Controversies and conflict drive the engine of almost all storytelling. Conflict isn't necessarily negative. It's about ideas clashing. The genome edited babies was a hugely controversial story that the picture of He Jiankui, who is also known as JK, brought to a head and occupied a whole lot of my time. But I kind of bristle at the notion that journalists look for controversy. I don't. Conflict is everywhere. Every new scientific paper that's published is basically challenging what already exists and saying, here's some information that should be considered and should force you to rethink things. That in itself is conflict as well. Science and animals. Animal stories are one of our most popular types of stories. They're some of the most accessible stories to high school students. I wrote a book about the science of the difference between humans and chimpanzees. I wrote an Outside magazine article about hybrid animals. And this polo rider here has cloned many of his horses. He's the most accomplished polo rider in the world. So animals are a great way to introduce people to scientific topics and to dive deeper into complex issues. I write about technology, and technology might seem boring to people, but it's actually, there's a way to make it exciting. And I look for angles to bring technology to life through issues and individuals again. There's an old dictum from the Watergate era of follow the money. And following the money often leads to really fascinating insights about how science is working. CRISPR, the genome editing technology has become an enormous industry. Philanthropy has become a greater and greater influence in the funding of science. And HIV/AIDS received so much money that I did an investigative package about following where all that money went and how it was used properly and improperly in different places around the world. But where do I go? I follow the virus. That's one of the cornerstones of my career too. Pulitzer Center has been very influential in helping me visit many places in the world that I wouldn't have been able to visit otherwise. I have made HIV/AIDS the center of my career for kind of happenstance reasons. It was because I started looking into the work Jonas Salk was doing, but then it broadened from there. And at this point, I've covered the virus in about 50 different countries around the world. My work has appeared, as Esther has noted, all over the place, and I'm extremely proud of having published in the Surface Journal. which is a great magazine. I really, at this point in my career, don't care a great deal about where the work appears, as long as the publication is something I respect, or the outlet, the media outlet, is something that I think I'll be proud of after it appears. When I was younger, as with many journalists, I had goals of, oh, I want to have a story in the New Yorker, or I want to have a story in the New York Times Magazine. At this point, none of that really matters a great deal to me. I want to have stories that are solid, that create conversation, contribute to conversation, and I don't care. And Science Magazine's a terrific platform, and I pretty much just write for science these days, although I have side projects with TV and radio. So who's the audience? Well, today my audience is high school teachers, and I imagine most of you know Mr. Hand. And so I try to gear what I'm doing toward whomever I anticipate is receiving the information. That's one of the trickiest things about journalism, is guessing at where your words are going to land and the impact they're going to have. We never really know. But I think because it likes the picture of Mr. Hand so much. When do I work? Well, it's news these days is a fire hose. When I started doing this, I'm 61. I was the editor of my high school newspaper. I've been doing journalism since I was 15. When I started, it was a much slower paced process. And now it's just 24/7. And the basic tool, though, for me is the same. It's filtering the flood of information and knowing, I've said this before, but it's knowing how to use the library. It's knowing how to find the good books in a building that has 5 floors of books. So that really hasn't changed. There's just more, the library is larger than it's ever been. So it's more of a challenge. Why do I do it? Well, I'm bilingual in science, and that helps me a great deal. I like to look into things that are interesting and significant. I like the world of ideas. I like having access to unusual things. When I was working on my chimp book, I got to go into the field in Uganda and follow chimp researchers around as they followed chimps around. And this is a photo of me following this one chimp around who eventually got very sick of me and kind of charged me. But I was trying to keep my proper distance. But I get to go to many, many places I'd never see. And I often joke that when I'm visiting a place, I go everywhere a tourist never goes. I meet the most fascinating people. I have endless curiosity, and it's a way to make a living. But I also do it to spotlight problems and highlight solutions. This is a package of stories I did with Pulitzer Center support and in collaboration with the PBS NewsHour. And it looked at 3 places around the world that were struggling to respond to their HIV/AIDS epidemics. This little boy, this 12-year-old boy, is dying from AIDS in Nigeria at a point in time when good drugs are available. You should never see this. There never should have been this type of illness in this young boy. But his story was complicated, and the country has the highest number of children born to HIV-infected mothers of any country. And so we looked into this from the perspective of what can be done about it. And one thing that was creative was this Catholic church was offering HIV tests. And the way they did it was unique. They asked all pregnant women to come to the front for a special blessing. And then, hey, after the service, we're going to test you for malaria and hepatitis B and HIV. Is just mixed into it. And so they didn't stigmatize anyone. And then if you did test positive, they helped you get the drugs to help save your own life, but also to prevent mother-to-child transmission. And their initial data looked incredibly promising. Just to be clear, this little boy and his father gave us permission to tell his story and show his image because they wanted people to understand the dilemmas they faced. And I'm very careful to not show images or tell stories and identify people without their consent. I also try to look at things at country levels. And this was that same project. Russia has a really huge problem of HIV infection to this day. It accounts for more than 80% of the new infections in Europe. And we wanted to understand why and who was doing what, and again, to look at it through the lens of the country. You can't see the response to any problem unless you understand what they are facing in their place, both politically and economically. Russia has a very large problem with HIV being spread through injecting drug use, though that has dropped over time. So it's now about half, or sexual transmission, half injecting drug use. The Russian government has had very repressive attitudes toward helping people who inject drugs, and have not been, not bought into the scientific evidence that providing clean needles can slow transmission rates. But this, in Kazan, we met a group that was providing clean needles to people who used, and done by a non-governmental organization that still existed. Many have been shut down by the government. The middle photo shows a leading doctor, HIV/AIDS doctor in St. Petersburg, who married an HIV-infected man and went public with their relationship to help destigmatize things. And the photo of the man looking in the mirror is a famous TV anchor in Russia who went public about his own HIV infection, and after we did this story, went public about his own sexual orientation. And Russia has not been open about its spread of HIV/AIDS in the gay community there, which has led to more problems for the country. And I also like to get way off the beaten path. In Zimbabwe, I went to a village that had a few hundred HIV-infected people, and more than 95% of them had suppressed their viral levels over 2 years' time because of a unique program that brought medicines to the village church once every 2 months and checked in with everyone. And hugely successful. In Mfangano Island in Kenya, I visited a program that did massive community testing for HIV and many other things, once again to reduce the stigma, and had a very high HIV prevalence in that community, and tried to get everyone on treatment. In Ukraine, they had a methadone program that I was able to observe. In Russia, methadone is illegal. And we know from many, many studies that opiate substitutes help reduce the spread of HIV. In San Francisco, I went to single room occupancy, where basically people who are struggling to survive were taken to the doctor by health department assistants who would make sure they had their appointments. I went down more than a half mile into a mine in Botswana to watch an HIV training program in the mine with the most captive audience you could imagine. And in Haiti and Port-au-Prince, I watched a program that tried to help sex workers transition into other work that presented less risk. And one of their creative solutions was to teach them to be dance instructors. And I also do this job to help clarify crisis. Sorry, the word crisis is cut off. Or no, maybe it's not. That's just my screen. The COVID-19 explosion can be seen in these slides, just in the red dots. You know, from early January, it was in China. That's all we knew about. And then with all the travel that happened all around the world, it very quickly became what we have today, which is only 6 months later. If you don't know this website, it's the Johns Hopkins site. I would encourage you to visit it, show it to your students. It's really authoritative and useful and easy to interpret. And you can break it down by country and even within counties, within the countries. It's a tremendous resource. The first reaction was what? And the team that I work with, I first did a story January 9th. One of the other reporters had done one earlier. after the Wall Street Journal reported that there was a novel coronavirus in China that explained this outbreak of an unusual pneumonia. And despite all the rhetoric about, oh, who knew, I quoted someone in a story I did on January 14th, the head of the Wellcome Trust, who is also an infectious disease researcher, Jeremy Farrar, saying that he suspected this outbreak was not going to go away anytime soon. So we knew in early January, certainly by mid-January, that this could go all around the world. What is the origin? That remains a mystery. I've done several stories about origin. I think they're fascinating. I wish we had more data. Theories flourish in the absence of data, so there have been a lot of conspiracy theories and the like. I was the first to report that the seafood market where the outbreak was first noticed likely was not the origin. And I continue to look for new studies about origin. There's been a tremendous amount of confusion, and there remains a tremendous amount of confusion about this virus and how it's spreading, and the speed at which it's spreading. And so several stories that I've done have tried to offer clarity in very confusing circumstances. We all now know about the notion of flattening the curve. And so we've looked repeatedly at what are different strategies to flatten the curve. And I did a feature story that I coincidentally had started working on in October about the impact of seasonality on diseases. And that is another aspect of flattening the curve. And I think one of the hardest things for people to understand is this is a combinatorial thing. It's not one thing. We have many ways to flatten the curve. And the real goal of the COVID-19 response right now is to keep our hospitals functioning. That, yes, we want to reduce disease and save lives, but really the crisis is about keeping hospitals functioning. We also had a testing debacle in the United States that is well known at this point, and we've covered that as best we could. The government has been very difficult to work with. The CDC researchers who were at the center of this in the beginning were allowed to speak with me, and then they were not. That's created a great deal of confusion in and of itself. The politics of this are inescapable. They're everywhere. Everyone knows about it, and we've covered it closely. I did an interview in March with Anthony Fauci that received a lot of attention because Dr. Fauci and I have known each other for many, many years. I started covering HIV in 1989. He's been a source of mine for many, many years. And he speaks very candidly with me. And we spoke very candidly that day where I confronted him about how do you feel about being put in a situation where the president is saying things that go against science and you're standing in the background? And how do you deal with that? And as you can see in this photo in the center, they're all clustered together there. This was at a point in time when they had already declared that you should have no more than 10 people in a room and you should have 6 feet of separation. So the interview was very provocative, in part because Dr. Fauci was so blunt and honest about what he was going through. China's experience has been hard to document in large part because China does not allow its researchers to speak openly, but I was able to interview the head of the China CDC and another leading epidemiologist at the China CDC. And those interviews were really eye-opening. The head of the Chinese CDC on March 27th said to me, the biggest mistake we were making is we weren't wearing masks. And a few days later, that started to shift, I think in part because of his declaration. I'm not taking credit for that shift. There were many forces, but I think that interview had some impact. I also do fundamental research and what some people think is the boring stuff, but I don't think it's boring at all. I think there's a way to make it lively, and I struggle to do that. Looking at things like animal research that informs us about drugs and vaccines, or what the virus really looks like, and how you can use laboratory tests to spot hidden infections. Epidemiology is a critical topic in this, and again, it leads to some very confusing issues about how do you model spread, how do you check blood to see what antibodies people have, but it's central to understanding what's happening. We've done many, many stories about treatments. I'm most optimistic about the monoclonal antibodies that are on the horizon that have just started human trials. These are antibodies that specifically target the virus. Every drug we've seen so far is basically a repurposed drug. It's not a drug designed specifically for this virus, but these monoclonals are treatments that specifically do go after SARS-CoV-2, the name of the virus. And finally, I still love vaccines. They're the centerpiece of my interest in COVID-19 as well. And I've done many, many stories about this vaccine search, which is unlike any vaccine search I've ever seen. There are now more than 150 candidates. More than a dozen have entered human trials. And there's more money and more interest in pushing vaccines forward more quickly than ever before. I was able on June 2nd to go into the busiest COVID-19 ICU in San Diego. They were generous to allow me to PPE up and go in. And it was fascinating. I learned a tremendous amount seeing the disease. And I had been most frustrated that I was covering a disease I had never seen. So I learned a lot, and that's a story that has yet to come out. I owe a great deal of thanks to everyone who supports me and allows me to have this very privileged job. And the Pulitzer Center has been a key supporter of my work now for many years. I mean, dating back to, I think, 2012, 2013. So thank you all very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions that I can.
Awesome. Thank you. Can we send a virtual applause to John through the chat, or I'll do some here.
That's okay.
And just to quickly review, we heard about a lot of things that we can ask questions about. We started by hearing about science reporting and different ways to engage students in storytelling around science. So feel free to ask questions there about different themes that John has reported on. We talked about HIV prevention and also different places where HIV has been reduced, where it's increasing, specifically looking at Africa and Eastern Europe, and programs in those two locations, but also the rise. I think I wrote down the statistic, John, am I right? Was it 80% growth in Russia of HIV cases?
Yeah, new infection cases. And I might have misstated it. It might just be Eastern Europe, but I think it probably is all of Europe. I need to double check that fact, but any way about it, Russia disproportionately has new HIV infections, and it still is struggling with things that we have tools, they exist, and Russia just doesn't aggressively use them.
And we also, so please continue, John has extensive experience. I know he only got to share a little bit of around reporting on HIV. So ask your questions on that. Also, we then moved to talking about research into the causes of COVID-19, into vaccination, into the way politics are playing into the virus, reporting from on the impacts of the virus in different parts of the world. So please continue to add your questions. We've got some started right now, but I think we could definitely take more than we have so far. So please continue to add. So the first question I'm seeing here, John, is about, I see a question from Daryl about the concern with people not believing the science, facts, questions about facts, scientific research, journalistic accounts of COVID-19. What advice do you have for teachers about how to talk about that with their students? Based on what you've seen.
That's very tricky. And my youngest son just graduated high school, and I've been a soccer coach of high school kids for many years. And they're the most difficult. They don't see anyone in their friend groups getting sick. And they basically don't believe it. And they also have a need to socialize that far exceeds my need to socialize. And I think there are a few things for high school kids that are important to emphasize. And one is that your actions impact people outside your friend group. They impact your parents and your grandparents, and you don't want to harm them. So first of all, keep that in mind. I think for many adults, they also haven't seen the disease in many parts of the country or many parts of the world even when there's a lot of spread. I mean, in my community here, I live in a small beach town in San Diego. I don't know of anyone who has been infected in my neighborhood, but I do have friends who've been hospitalized. I do have family members who've been infected in other places. And I think part of what's happening is similar to what's happened with vaccines that have been very successful. So the polio vaccine has basically eliminated polio from much of the world. It's not eradicated, but it's eliminated. And so parents say, why should I vaccinate my child? You know, there is no polio. Well, there is no polio because people are using a vaccine. And we're not seeing that much COVID-19 in many places because places are sheltering in place and people are wearing masks and they're taking precautions to slow the spread. So that's creating some of this blowback, is that we've had some success. And we can now see in places that have been cavalier and said, you know, open up the nail salons, do everything, this is all a hoax, their rates of new infection are skyrocketing. So I think you can use those examples to reinforce the notion that these things do work to slow spread. And we don't want to have what happened in New York happen everywhere. We don't want to have what happened in Iran and happened in Wuhan and happened in Northern Italy to happen here. And you can show them what happened there. Show them what it looks like when hospital systems collapse. There's a dictum in journalism, show, don't tell. Show your students as much as you can. Show them. Don't just tell them.
And on that question about showing our students, in your reporting, were there any particular examples that really stuck with you that that visualized the how this what this disease can do and the impact of it?
I mean, every day. I mean, I've always worked long hours. I've never worked as much as I have since January 8th. I mean, I'm working some days 18 hours, and that's not an exaggeration. Every day I'm seeing things I never imagined seeing before. I did have a profound experience when I went into the ICU and saw with my own eyes the patients and what was happening with the patients. It wasn't what I had imagined. For one thing, most everyone was knocked out on very strong drugs, because to have a ventilator tube to be intubated requires very strong opiates and benzodiazepines that essentially knock you out. And I wasn't able to interview any of these patients, which hadn't occurred to me, that everyone in this ICU would essentially be like a comatose patient, and which makes it very hard to care for them and very, very frightening for the healthcare providers. So Fareed, I mean, the answer to the question is every day I see things that rattle me, because I've just never seen anything like it before. And I've been doing this a long time, and I've seen a lot of really bad things.
I'm seeing questions related to COVID-19 and also questions around science journalism. So a few more questions on COVID-19, and then we'll definitely answer these questions on science journalism as well. I believe it's Gloria had a question about states opening up, and especially talking to students about that. What are your thoughts on states opening up?
Well, so this is one of those areas where there's a tremendous amount of confusion and there aren't solid answers to things. The Johns Hopkins site has a fascinating tracker that looks at the percent of people in a location, in a state, who test positive. And their metric is 5%. If 5% or more people are testing positive, you can't open up. You need to ratchet down. But I've said this before, and it holds true. We're playing an accordion here. We're going to need to restrict and open up and restrict and open up based on how much virus is circulating. And it's not a static thing. We're not just crossing a finish line and, oh boy, we're done. We may get there with biomedical interventions. There may be really powerful monoclonal antibodies that change how we address this, or a good, safe, and effective vaccine. We're all hoping for that. But until we get there, we're playing the accordion. And we have to get everyone used to the notion of using science to direct us to decide how much we can open up. So 5% testing positive is different from 4%, and that's different from 3%, and it's different from 2%. And when you get down below 1%, open up everything. But that's how I think it through.
I'm going to combine two questions that are about maybe underreported stories around the coronavirus. The first is about populations who might not be getting a lot of attention, and the second is about issues that might not. So the first, Maha is asking about specifically the impact of COVID-19 on Palestinian populations, especially the question specifically reads, have you been to the Israeli occupied Palestinian territories or the Gaza Strip, or maybe some of your colleagues at Science? So questions about that situation specifically, or other communities and how they're uniquely impacted by the virus. Actually, maybe I'll just start with that question.
Yeah, so, well, I haven't been allowed to travel. The only place I've been to is a hospital in San Diego that I could drive to.
That's right.
I have been to Gaza in the past, and the Palestinian territories, and I understand the difficulties of communicating health problems in regions of the world where there's restricted movement. And I've been to many regions in the world that are occupied territories, or under siege, or in conflict in some way, and healthcare information typically doesn't flow easily out of those places because no information travels easily out of those places. So that is an excellent idea of a story. We don't have anyone based in that area who could go there and report on the ground, but we certainly could report on it from what information is coming out. And it's a good idea, and it's something I think we should look into. I do, as far as finding novel ideas, I would just encourage you to look at what we do. We have a team of people working on this, more than 30 people, and we're always looking for things that others don't know. I mean, news is things that are new, things that you don't know. And we pride ourselves at Science at reporting things that others haven't reported. And so every day, if you log on to our site, I promise you, you will find something you won't see anywhere else. And that's why I am at Science. I love being part of a group that cares deeply about doing original, fresh reporting that highlights things that aren't being highlighted elsewhere.
The next question around other ways that COVID-19 might be affecting other medical issues. Ellen asked a question about if there's been research on the impact of COVID on organ transplantation. Do you know about that, or other public health issues that are impacted by the coronavirus that we should be aware of?
Well, there's been a huge impact on elective surgery. Mm-hmm. And some organ transplantation isn't crisis implantation. It's something that you schedule and that you do. Many people who have kidney failure will schedule it. And I don't know how much those have been put off, but I imagine there have been important impacts on many people who live in areas that have shut down elective surgery. But otherwise, I don't know what impact it's had on organ transplantation. I would anticipate that in hard-hit places that they've slowed down tremendously.
A clarification from Maha here, and thank you, Maha, for sharing your some resources in the chat. The the specific question was around human rights violations. And this specific question is about the Israeli military in making it difficult for Palestinians to fight COVID. So that's the specific question. If you know anything about that, please share. But I know you were saying you hadn't been able to travel. So any other, just for all of us, any other human rights issues that maybe we aren't aware of. But please, if you know about that issue, let us know.
Well, I mean, human rights are central issues to all infectious disease responses. And the HIV/AIDS world has highlighted that in a way that never happened before. And we see with COVID-19, again, disproportionate disease in the United States in several minority populations, in poorer communities. Access to healthcare makes a huge difference. So those are critically important stories, and we do them all the time. The specific about Israel and Gaza, I haven't looked into it. It's a good idea.
Moving into some questions about science reporting, Ron had a question about what the response has been to reporting on vaccination and on the search for a vaccine, given questions that some communities have around using vaccines.
Yes, it's a tricky one. I mean, there's a lot of vaccine hesitancy, which is different from being anti-vaccine, but there is a lot of vaccine hesitancy in general. And there's been a concern voiced by some researchers at naming the US project Operation Warp Speed, because one of the great fears is that vaccines are rushed to market, and that they aren't properly tested, and that harm occurs because people are greedy and not careful enough. And so one researcher I quoted said, warp speed feeds that fear of moving too quickly. I think it's going to be a real issue when a safe and effective vaccine does exist, whether people will go get it. And it will be the same issue that the vaccine world has been facing with all the other vaccines, is how do you address the concerns people have without and respect their concerns. I think there's something that is often forgotten about vaccines that I flicked at earlier, and people are often confused about vaccines because they don't see the disease that the vaccine protects against. In areas where they have seen heavy losses from COVID-19 and severe disease in their families, I think people will be lining up for the vaccine and begging to be first. In places where they haven't seen much disease, it might be a very different scenario where people have to see and be offered information that helps them understand why they want this. But COVID-19 is different from so many other diseases I've covered in that the virus infects everyone through the air, and that's different from HIV, which is sexually transmitted and creates pockets of vulnerability that are different and lead to a different conception of who needs protection and what sort of protection you need. You can also protect yourself from HIV with means other than a vaccine. With COVID-19, you can protect yourself with ways other than a vaccine, but they're pretty cumbersome, like sheltering in place. I don't mean wearing a mask. I mean, losing your job and, things that have really harmed our economies and our societies. So I think there will be more desire for a vaccine in general, because I don't know of anyone who loves shelter in place. I just don't.
We have some great questions here from Ron, who I'm going to try to combine actually these questions because they kind of relate to education and journalism. So the first question he asked about is questioning of vaccination maybe connected to the way it's been shared by talked about by educators and by journalists? Is that well, he brings up educators. Should it be taught differently in schools? And I'm hoping I can expand that question to also hear a little bit more about especially studying HIV for so long, when there are a lot of treatments that we've seen work in some places. What's the role of education in regions where it is not, where those rates are increasing, and sort of what have you seen around the role education can play?
Well, I mean, for the vaccine, for teaching kids in particular about vaccines, and I do some high school teaching, vaccines have had more impact on human health than anything other than cleaning the water. And we are all in this together. And when it comes to vaccines, you see the impact of herd immunity, of people doing things collectively, unlike most anything else in medicine. And I think impressing upon kids the power of collective action and the responsibilities we have to each other with vaccines is the key message. You know, vaccines work on an individual level, but they're most important on a societal level. And COVID-19, if we had a safe and effective vaccine, would not be a problem. It wouldn't. It would just fade out. It might not disappear, but it would go way into the background. And people, I think, misunderstand what vaccines are oftentimes. You know, they think that they're these really weird artificial things. In my mind, vaccines are one of the most natural medicines that exist. They're taking the virus or bacteria or fungus that harm you and turning it against itself, using it to basically educate your immune system without being infected by the real thing. And to me, that's better than any chemical entity you're going to take. It's a fabulous natural way to protect yourself. And indeed, some vaccines were natural to begin with. The first vaccine is the smallpox vaccine, which was created from cowpox virus, which was naturally infecting people. So I think that we have to be clear about what they are and the impact they have when we use them collectively. In terms of HIV, yeah, people have to understand that if you get good treatment, if you know your status, first of all, if you get tested and you know you're infected, the drugs that exist are very good. You can lead a normal life. You will live to a very old age. And if you use them regularly, you will reduce the virus in your body to such a low degree that you won't transmit the virus to others. People all around the world, I've met people who are infected, and to a person, they don't want to infect other people. People don't want to harm other people. By and large, we're not a bunch of sociopaths running around. We are people who care about each other. And if you inform someone that you can lead a normal life and also protect your loved ones and your communities by taking these medicines, people are by and large very eager to do that. People everywhere like to be healthy. That's a given. People everywhere don't necessarily want to be educated, but they do want to be healthy. And you know, I don't meet people who say I want to be sick. I meet people who say I don't want to go to school, but I don't meet people who say I want to be sick. And so it's I think really building on that fundamental human need to be healthy and to live in a healthy community. It's something that everyone plugs into.
Continuing on this, on sort of on education here, maybe also into the reporting process. We have a question here from a participant, RB Kanakaraj. I hope I've said that in a way that's not too terrible. Who wrote, I teach a unit on how technology impacts healthcare. I was wondering what the most interesting, creative way that you have seen technology be used by reporters or the general population to gather data or provide information, specifically on COVID, but anything that you've seen would be great.
Well, COVID gives you great opportunities to teach about the impact of technologies. Look at what China does. I'm not saying this would work everywhere else, but China uses cell phones to track your health status and uses a traffic light system of green, yellow, red. And if you leave your region, you leave your city, your phone automatically goes to yellow because the GPS is tracked. And then when you go to get on a train, you have to show your health status. And if it's yellow, they won't let you on. And if you are in contact with somebody who's infected, you go to red. And is it draconian? Is it something the United States would do? Good questions. But it also is using technology to stop a virus. And other countries have done similar things with smartphones that are lighter, less invasive than that. But you know, it's a fascinating idea. And you can also use technology to do things like create safer schools. What if we could easily test everyone before they went into school buildings? One way you could do it with technology is you can pool blood and then look at 100 people at the same time and say, is there any COVID in this pooled blood sample? If not, those 100 kids go in. What if the technology could happen in 15 minutes? And it can. I mean, there are ways to do this. It alters how we perceive of safety and our own normalcy, returning to normalcy. So home testing, spitting into a cup some saliva and doing a test that gives you a result, or checking your temperature. I have a thermometer here, and with everyone in my house for quite a while, I was checking everyone's temperature every day. Most of Asia checks everyone's temperature with temperature guns before people walk into buildings. Those are interesting technologies. The technologies used to make vaccines, there are 8 different technologies being used. Compare and contrast to students of how you can make a vaccine with different technologies, I think is fascinating. So those are some ideas, but I think COVID-19 really opens the door to explore the power of technology to help us. And technology is a double-edged sword. I mean, I've said this before, but it's like an axe. You can use an axe to chop down trees and build a home and make fire, or you can use it to cut off someone's head. But the axe isn't the problem. The axe can be a solution or it can be a problem. And that's how I see technologies, is they can be used for good or for bad, and it's up to us to decide how we're going to do that.
Yeah, speaking of that axe and how it can be used in different ways, I'm going to ask 2 more questions before we open it up to some brainstorming by the group. And John, if you're available to stay for that, I think that might be
I have a crazy busy schedule. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, then we'll get your final remarks before we start that part. So the first question, I'm going to combine a question from Ellen and from William. William asked, does the Russian government benefit by not educating its citizens on COVID-19? Does the past experience of government-run media cause citizens to be leery of content presented to them? And then Ellen's question is about what positive messaging what other messaging you've seen that's working well regarding COVID-19 or HIV. So to William's question, where do you see governments maybe not educating? He asked about Russia specifically, but then Ellen's question is, where is it working positively?
So I don't know what's happening in Russia with COVID-19 education. I imagine it's similar to what's happening in the United States, where there's a federal response and there are local responses. In California, where I live, my community isn't controlled by the White House. Whatever Donald Trump and the administration decides to do, it doesn't really have as dramatic an impact on my life as what my governor and what my mayor decide. And I imagine the same is true in Russia, and my travels in Russia, and I've been to many places in Russia, tell me that local politicians, St. Petersburg is very different from Kazan, which is very different from Yekaterinburg, which is very different from Moscow. And if you look at the HIV response in those 4 cities I just mentioned, which we did do, and the PBS NewsHour team shows videos of this, you see wildly different HIV responses in each place. So the federal government can have a perspective and a response, but locals again and again are going to take control of their health situations. And at the end of the day, the federal government can have a very powerful impact on coordinating everything and providing supplies and giving direction. But in the absence of that, or even with bad information, local governments can do what they want oftentimes, even in places like Russia. That's what I've seen.
Thank you. And then I guess to close out our Q&A section here, there's a question from Ron about how do we improve the trust in science in general by the US population and in the world. He asks specifically about climate change, but maybe if you could also share in there, how do we improve trust in science, but also maybe thinking of us as educators, how we might get students excited about science.
Well, I think one of the important concepts is to be honest and transparent about what we do and don't know, to not expect too much from science. Science is all about gathering the best information to make decisions that are as evidence-based as possible. But science isn't about belief. That's what religion does. Science is about saying, I'm willing to change my mind tomorrow if new evidence shows up to show me something new. And I think teaching kids how to think scientifically is the challenge. That it's a positive thing to change your mind. That's not bad. In politics, we hold politicians to the standard of, you once said, and how come you changed your mind? You're a hypocrite. In science, if you stand up in front of a group of scientists and say, that theory I had that I won the Nobel Prize for, well, it was wrong. I have new data and it's led me to this new conclusion. You'll be celebrated. You're a great scientist. And I think it's understanding that process and that construct of thinking that is the key to teaching people, and teaching kids in particular, how to build trust in science, because it's the process of gathering evidence and changing your mind when the evidence points to a new direction. So that's what I would really get at, is that framework of thinking, which is very different from saying, this is the Lord and I believe it, and I don't care what evidence you bring to me, this is my Lord. And many religious people are scientific and can live in both worlds. So I don't want to paint and tar with a wide brush. You can be both, but they're very different ways of thinking.
Thank you so much. And I say on that, another round of applause and gratitude to you, John. We appreciate you.
No, it's a pleasure. And I appreciate what high school teachers do. I've had 3 kids go through the public high school system here, and I know what enormous impact you have had on my kids. And my kids are all better people because of their teachers. And so I applaud what you do. It's a tough job, and I do guest lectures, and it's always a thrill to get in, and it's a thrill to get out. And I think doing it for 9 months at a time, and my brother is a high school teacher, is a really heroic job, and I hope you're well compensated for what you do.
We've got applause and gratitude coming into the chat and the Q&A box. And we have 9 minutes before our break. So we're now going to start processing what we're taking from this presentation and coming up with ideas. You are welcome to stay. I can hang around
okay. Till the half hour. I saw one question that I did want to address. Somebody had asked whether I get attacked by anti-vaccine people. Mm-hmm. I get attacked regularly. And I look at it through the lens of something Marilyn Quayle once said about her vice presidential husband, Daniel Quayle, getting attacked all the time. And she said, well, it means people are paying attention to him. And I'm not really much bothered by the attacks. If I make a mistake, I am really bothered. But if I've done nothing wrong and someone wants to rail about something, I typically write them a nice note back and say, thanks for writing. Hope you and your family are doing well during these difficult times. I don't engage in battle with them because I don't see the point. but I also don't take it personally. I look at it as kind of flattering that they're reading me. So.
Thank you so much, and I
Yeah.
appreciate you commenting on that.